This video is part of a webinar series on HIndudvesha, an educational series to explore and expose systemic Hindu phobia. This project is sponsored by AHAD, American Hindus Against Defamation, an initiative of the World Hindu Council of America, and Dharma Civilization Foundation.
So we are introducing a term called HIndudvesha. We'll have a lot to say about its relationship with the other term, the cognate term Hinduphobia. Now, we want to start with the question, what is a phobia? A phobia, very simply, is, as per the dictionary, an extreme or irrational fear of or aversion to something. Now, if you look at it in that sense, the question really that arises naturally is there or is there not a visceral fear of Hindus or Hinduism really? Is it widespread? After all, what is there to be so scared about the Hindus? The Hindus have not historically threatened anyone. The Hindus have not launched proselytizing missions, not tried to conquer and colonize the entire world. They're not enslaved, exterminated whole peoples like others have done. Now, if you look at the two terms, dvesha versus phobia, so if you look at dvesha, you get dislike and hatred. If you get phobia, you get fear and horror. Where they converge is repulsion and aversion. So here is a definition. Hindudvesha is a Sanskrit word. Dvesha is a Sanskrit word meaning aversion, repulsion, or hatred. A deep-rooted emotional response that negatively influences one's perception of the world. Something or some phenomenon in one's world. Hindudvesha, like systemic racism or anti-Semitism, is an ambient, all-encompassing discourse that denigrates and delegitimizes Hinduism, the Hindu people, as it relentlessly problematizes, dehumanizes, demonizes them as in the Hindus. Its accusatory rhetoric treats Hindus as objects or patients to be examined and diagnosed. It presupposes and concludes that something about the Hindus and Hinduism is irredeemably bad, wrong, evil, demonic. For example, here is a colonial era example taken from James Mill's History of British India. Now, every single adjective that's used in this extract have been used to describe the Hindus by James Mill. And this book, History of British India, became standard textbook material for all the British who participated in the governance of India in the colonial era. So if you look at the colonial roots of Hindudvesha, here is how it all started, right? There was what happened, then there's a discourse about what happened. There's the colonizer and the colonized. The British were the colonizers, India was colonized. And to use a Marxist lens, they were the exploiters and India got exploited. The Hindus were victims of this exploitation. But the discourse about what happened was transformed, it was different. It was framed differently. The British were presented in their own self-definition as emancipators, as civilizers. What were they civilizing? They were solving a problem within India, which is framed in terms of an exploited divide within India. And this construct, the discourse about what happened, is distinct from what really happened. Is one of the remarkable things about this discourse is that the British extracted some $45 trillion in current day terms over a 200-year period from India, profoundly impoverishing India, however. But they also rewrote the history of India to represent India as a doomed civilization which could not be redeemed without a European intervention. So there are two kinds of Hindudvesha. One is blatant, the other is blind. Blatant is conscious and explicit. Blind is unconscious and implicit. But in both cases, they represent themselves as an unbiased, objective truth, a discourse that represents unbiased, objective truth about the Hindus, literally relentlessly abuses the Hindus and Hinduism, either deliberately or consciously and consciously, or unconsciously and repetitively. The ambient pressure that is exerted by Hindu dvesha is like this. Something must be done to the Hindus. The Hindus must be secularized, they must be westernized, they must be anglicized, must be modernized, proselytized, converted, Christianized, Islamized. In any case, at the very least, they must be supervised. In the worst case, they must be silenced. Now, the problem that this ambient pressure that exerted by Hindu dvesha on the Hindus end up being ashamed and embarrassed of their own tradition. They get confused. They feel accused constantly. They have to be on the defensive and they feel denounced of Hindu dvesha. Now, recognizing Hindu dvesha, a checklist. Now, there's a lot on this slide, but I'll try to wrap it up very quickly. Are the Hindu people a legitimate people? Do they have a right to live as Hindus? Well, blatant Hindu dvesha would say no, never. Hindus are not a legitimate people. Blind Hindu dvesha may say maybe, maybe, but with appropriate oversight. Well, oversight from whom? Can the Hindu speak up as a Hindu, or does a Hindu have to be co opted in order to be legitimate? Blatant Hindu dvesha would say no, the Hindu voice must be silenced. Blind Hindu dvesha would say maybe they agree and conform. To what extent are the problems in Hindu society being caused by invasions and colonization, during which time the Hindus were completely the victims? Blatant Hindu dvesha would not even look at it, not even a little. Such questions are taboo, cannot ask them. Either willfully or blindly, never asked by blind Hindu dvesha. Is there anything positive or valuable that Hinduism has contributed to the world? No. Everything positive has to be appropriated, reassigned, allocated as having originated from some other part of the world. Blind Hindu dvesha really believes that very little, if anything, if even there was something of value, it was mostly accidental. Okay, so this sort of frames the conversation.
When you think of academia, what comes to your mind? Most of us think of academia as a place where learned people engage in philosophical discussions, where honest search for truth is the only agenda, where all opinions are entertained and given due respect. If this is the image of academia you carry in your mind, you probably have not come across Western academics called Indologists, a cabal which has made its business to pass ill informed and prejudicial commentary on Hindu Dharma for more than 200 years. Their nefarious enterprise started in Europe in early 1800s, driven in part by the moral need to justify the colonial occupation of India. Here we share some quotes from certain well-known Indologists of that era, each of them outdoing the other in bigotry and hate for the object of their so-called scholarship, and none too worried about the objectivity expected of respectable academics. At this point, you might be thinking, well, thank goodness the colonial period is over and done with. Surely Western Indology is no longer a problem. Unfortunately, you would be wrong. Western Indology is very much alive and well, and more vicious than ever. The only thing that has changed is the reason for its existence. Its new aim is to weaken the foundation of the Hindu society so as to make it easier for the Christian missionaries to harvest millions of dark heathen Hindu souls and bring them over to the quote unquote true faith. Indeed, they are willing to go to any length to further their nefarious cause, including blaming the Sanskrit language for the Jewish Holocaust. Now, you might be thinking that no rational human being can justify such idiotic statements. But apparently, many Western Indologists are beyond shame or embarrassment, their long list of academic degrees notwithstanding. The question is, should we take this academic stuff seriously? In practical terms, does any of it really matter? The answer is unfortunately yes. We do have to take it seriously. You see, Western Indologists have a huge influence on how Hindus are presented in school textbooks, news and social media, entertainment industry, and online resources such as the Wikipedia. In short, Western Indology serves as a major source of information about us in the Western world, and therefore shapes the perception of our neighbors and our co workers about who we are and what we stand for.
So, Equality Labs uses three methods of promoting its hatred. And it basically produces propaganda reports, articles, and hate-oriented artwork. Number two, it leverages social media to spread its hateful propaganda. And three, it motivates and inspires its social media followers and political allies to weaponize its hateful propaganda. So number one, we're going to talk about its propaganda material. So it produced this dubious cast report in 2018 based on a tenuous survey. And the survey is given this sort of veneer of objectivity, even though it's highly biased and not the least bit objective. It concludes that there's nothing more to Hinduism than caste. The second thing that this caste report does is it um, includes false and highly charged accusations about Hindu culture, religion, and society. Here's an example of the organization's hate-oriented artwork. They're very clever, so you can see the word smash. So smash is, a very subtle word, but it subtly implies violence. Now, this is the example of how they leverage social media. So you can see in this picture that the CEO of Twitter is in the middle of this picture and is surrounded by, I think, various members of Equality Labs. And it clearly illustrates that the CEO of Twitter is openly and happily adding credibility to this hate group and their vicious propaganda. This is a picture of how this organization is motivating its social media followers and political allies to weaponize its hatred. So this organization has succeeded in getting the government of California to weaponize its hate, and this, it's basically aiming to get Hindus branded as bigots who should be monitored and controlled. Now I want to go on to illustrate Hindudvesha and social media. There are many forms of Hindudvesha and social media, but I've just listed three examples. One is demeaning and insulting Hindu society and religion. Another one is calling for extermination of Hindus via genocide. And a third form is debasing sacred Hindu deities. So how does social media facilitate and propagate Hindu Dvesha? It does this by falsely designating Hindu Dvesha as a legitimate social justice and human rights discourse. And it also does this by stereotyping Hindus as privileged oppressors, thereby justifying the hatred and violence directed at them. So here's a example of high-profile media personalities who have demeaned and insulted Hindus and their culture and religion. So this lady was an NPR producer, and she equated Hinduism with piss drinking and dung worshipping. Okay, this is a slide where it's a call for Hindu Holocaust by this individual, and I think this was on Facebook. And this individual got an award from Penguin Random House. And then here's my last slide, which depicts a vulgar display and description of Hindu deities. And again, this was, I think, on Twitter. So these are just some examples of how forms of Hindudvesha on social media.
If we begin with the question, as you see on the screen, does mass media have any influence on people's minds? The answer may vary depending on who you're asking, right? If you ask those who are a little bit observant and analytical, then the answer would be an overwhelming yes. But if you ask those who see this completely from an entertainment perspective, then either consciously or ignorantly, they may say no. However, if you look at some research, many social scientists also concur that mass media has significant influence on shaping people's perception on policies, personalities, narratives, etc. So the mass media can include a lot of things, as you see on the screen. But for the purpose of today's webinar, I just wanted to specifically focus on movie industry and maybe a little bit on the streaming platforms. So as you may know, movie industry continues to play a significant role in influencing people's minds, sometimes in a good way or sometimes in a bad way. So in the Indian context, though, we hear that many attribute this media influence to the globalization effect post 90s. But I also watch some older movies, and if we keenly observe, right, even movies before the 90s did their part in portraying anything related to Hindu culture as inferior to that of the Western culture. And the Hindu Dvesha as a phenomenon is observed in Bollywood, as well as it dwindles down into the regional movie industries. And the same stereotypes, again, are naturally adopted by even Hollywood. So the pattern, I think, is obvious here. When I was piling this, I only wondered, whether this Tilakdhari Hindu in a negative or a villain role only increases collections at the box office, or they create these characters to serve a different purpose. I think most of us recognize the movies on this slide, and also I don't have to reiterate the point that I'm trying to make. These are some examples of how Hindu Dvesha is creeping into the streaming platforms, and obviously it actually seems that it's continuing to grow every day. These are just a couple of examples of so-called art and freedom of expression. So there is an interesting field called semiotics. So if we analyze these images through this semiotics, what we see that all these specific portrayal has a strategic use of symbolism to create hateful stereotypes against Hindus. And that leads to creating many other tropes, and that are commonly used in Hindu hating social media or print media. They're used by the trolls. And what we also see is a blatant mockery of Hindu customs and practices, which will increase inferiority complex, actually, especially among the younger generations of Hindus, so much so that they just want to distance themselves from these customs altogether. So I'm going to quickly wrap it up here. Let's think about why this happened. So many times there is an inability to actually recognize Hindu Dvesha, either consciously or sometimes innocently also it happens. But if we see, if all these movies and web series are being successful, we cannot deny that Hindus are actually the main reason. We are the ones who are going to these movies, clapping for these and increasing the TRPs and stuff like that. We Hindus have learned to put up with any level of Hindu Dvesha just for the sake of some short-term entertainment. And also another reason could be, we don't want to react because we always want the title of being the good guys. I also want to bring your attention to a well-organized and well-funded syndicate that's actually behind creating institutions such as this movie industry or networks whose only aim is to be creative in inventing and promoting the Hindu Dvesha, not just in India, but obviously around the world. And those who indulge in this Hindu dvesha, they're very confident actually that they don't have to face any consequences from Hindus. As far as what we can do, so we need to improve our awareness and understanding of this concept called Hindu dvesha, not hesitate to talk about it openly, call it out, express our dissent in a constitutional or a democratic way. And the important thing is to continue to be part of these kind of webinars, educate ourselves, and get involved as a community.
So I am continuing the narrative of how Hindudvesha exhibits itself in news media. So these are a couple of examples. The cartoons were published in New York Times. On the left side, you see the cartoon that was published during the Mangalyaan mission of ISRO. And on the right side, it talks about Prime Minister Modi ji's diplomacy, and it uses caricatures the popular form of God Nataraja. So these may not look like obvious symbols of hate or representation of hate, but when you look at it from an outsider's perspective, like Hindus may look at God Nataraja as a god, a powerful god, and they may think that Modi is being represented as a powerful god. But do the non-Hindus, does the rest of the world look at it in the same way, or is it making fun of Modi ji and the sacred symbols of Hinduism? In the next slide, you see that on the left side, we have Modi ji's picture as it was represented when he won the election on the cover of Time magazine. And on the right side, we have Erdogan from Turkey and how he was represented when he was leading his nation. So in Modi ji's case, they had to get a picture. It is not even a real photograph. And it had to be morphed in such a way that he looks kind of cruel and uncompromising. Whereas Erdogan looks more like a determined business executive. And they even use the title divider in chief for Modi ji. Whereas for Erdogan, they acknowledge that he is a pro-Islamic leader, but in bracket they emphasize that he is secular, democratic, Western, and friendly. These two are very popular pictures from Washington Post. It has become a meme. So Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the ISIS leader, was called an austere religious scholar, whereas the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, Yogi ji, he is called as a militant monk, even though he is a well-educated person with a master's degree in math. He has been a member of parliament, elected multiple times. This is another example. CNN's documentary, there was a series called Believer, which was produced by Reza Aslan. And the very first episode of Believer was on Hindu Dharma. And if you see the subsequent episodes, are all on not very big religions, not well-known world religions, other than the last one maybe, which is the Jewish religion. But the other ones, like the Doomsday Cult in Hawaii, the Voodoo in Hawaii, and Scientology and Santa Muerte in Mexico. So these are all some obscure cults that they have taken to caricaturize. But when talking about Hindu Dharma, they bring up the Hindu Aghoris. And they use that to represent, they talk about cannibalism and all the different practices of Aghori. In one of the subsequent conversations or interviews, Reza Aslan himself acknowledged that he found the Hinduism that he was looking for to portray. So he deliberately wanted to portray a certain view of Hindu Dharma. And Hindudvesha becomes most obvious when the media starts talking about Hindu festivals. And all the examples that I'm showing here are from media in Bharat, in India itself. On the left side, you see that Diwali is called a festival of fats. Whereas for Christmas, they talk about food in much more flattering terms. Festival of Kadwa Chauth, every year Kadwa Chauth and Raksha Bandhan are considered to be patriarchal representations. Jallikattu and Diwali becomes festival that harasses or That's a cruel practice against animals. Whereas Eid, where rituals, sacrifice of animals happens on the streets, it's called a feast of sacrifice that the world celebrates. And these are few more examples of Holi and Navaratri. Holi is, as you may all recognize, Holi is becoming very popular in the US these days. It's a fun festival. Everybody wants to participate in it, regardless of their cultural and religious background. And because of that, from last year, we have been seeing an attempt to hijack Holi by many different groups, anti-Hindu groups on college campuses and other places within the US as well. So as we saw in my slides, it starts with in it happens in many at many different levels, obvious as well as subtle levels, and the objective of all this by media is to make it okay to have these kinds of attitudes towards Hindu dharma, towards Hindu culture, civilization, towards the Hindu people in Bharat, in the US, and all over the world.
Om Namaste, Sitaram, Ram Ram in the tradition of my ancestors. My presentation looks at a small, informal, stratified survey I conducted to find out how aware Hindus were about the different ways that Hindudvesha expresses itself in daily living. Only self-identified Hindus participated. Here we see how aware were Hindus to Hindu-Dveshic actions, words, writings, and behaviors. 50% of the respondents said Hindus had little awareness. 40% said Hindus had a moderate to high awareness, and 10% said they had no awareness. The respondents listed to show some of the Hindu Dveshic words and writings: intolerant. We were called saffron terrorists, kuli, idol worshipper, filthy Brahmin, devil worshipper, Hindutva, RSS, bhakta, sativrata, curry munchers, wife killers, heathens, pagans, cow piss. So here are the writings that they identified: Marxist, leftist, and conversion writings. Writings that delinked Hinduism from yoga. The Pakistani textbooks with disinformation on Hindus. The American Academy demonizing Hindu deities and civilization. American school books and misrepresentations of Hinduism. Some behaviors and actions that they listed. We faced racial oppression, various parts of the world, job discrimination, attacks on tangible Hindu expressions like our mandirs and murtis in India and other countries, bullying, making fun of the deities, vulgar images, Hindu genocide in Pakistan through rape and forced conversion, and the aggressive American Christian evangelical thrust of conversion all over the world. And here we see some manifestations of Hindu Dvesha in our living environment. Left on the walls of the Swaminarayan Temple in Kentucky, defacing the mandir, academic writings that distort Hinduism and Hindu nationalism online. And here, you're seeing Hinduism and Hindu nationalism online and Hindutva. On the right, sacred thread of men being cut off, indicating an intent to exterminate the Hindu intellectual and ritual leadership. Pakistani Hindus, a forgotten genocide. A UK report on Hinduism in schools says that the misinformation about Hinduism has led to bullying and racial hate crimes against Hindu children in the schools. Guyana and Fiji, Caribbean countries, especially Guyana. Then we have Fiji, all post-colonial countries where Hindus have consistently been victims of institutional racism and political victimization. Want to look here at India and the diaspora, India's history with its foreign invasions, imperialism and colonialism. This should leave us asking, who came? What did they do? What was their mission? What was the impact on the indigenous peoples? February 14, 2019, the suicide bombing of 40 of Central Reserve Police Force in India. This was led by the Pakistan-based terror group. The jihadists also released a video describing Hindus as impure, polytheistic, cow urine drinkers. Now, we, the adults, must, as far as possible, provide all children with a positive environment in which to grow and flourish, and to prepare them to identify and counteract any Hindudvesha they are likely to encounter in their environment. I end by asking, how aware are we?
The primary purpose of this webinar was to give you a bird's eye view of Hindudvesha, what it is, where it is coming from, and what its underlying purpose is. The key message we would like you to take away from this webinar is simply this. Hindu identity is under serious and sustained attack from a number of directions. Be it the academia, be it the entertainment industry, be it the mass media, be it the social media, or a number of highly organized syndicates with very deep pockets. They're all working in concert to attack our sacred identity, and their main purpose is to shake the Hindu social structure from its roots. Unfortunately, and this is something we know instinctively, Hindu community by and large remains either unaware or unconcerned or both. In fact, this frog sitting in a bucket of water which is being heated from below is a good metaphor for where we find ourselves today. The frog is certainly feeling the warmth, but not the heat yet, and it thinks everything is just heavenly. That's one metaphor. The other one that comes to mind is that of a cat and a pigeon. The pigeon sees the cat coming towards him, and he is somewhat aware of the danger, but then is too lazy to take any evasive action. Instead, it just closes its eyes, thinking that since it cannot see the cat probably cannot see him either. Sadly, the cat is not persuaded by that logic, and it usually does not end well for the pigeon. So, we have a mission for this webinar series. Our mission is very simple. It is to raise the awareness of the Hindu diaspora about the growing threat around them to their very identity and potentially to their very existence as a community and as a distinct cultural entity. We plan to hold many webinars of this type on a fairly regular basis. The plan is to hold them roughly once a month. In future months, we will be exploring a variety of subjects associated with Hindudvesha. For instance, we will look at the historical roots of this phenomenon, how it manifests itself in schools and colleges, and once we have reached a certain level of understanding of the subject, we will talk about potential strategies to counteract it and many more topics of that nature. This is a dialogue that is long overdue, and we're happy to be bringing it to the Hindu diaspora today. Please do not forget to join us in future installments of this series. Namaste.